You could be building an experimentation program for scale, but you've got all these blind spots, you've got these bad habits in your program that you've established just to get to that point.
What is going on, certified homies? Welcome to another episode of From A to B. Jeff Shiva, and I'm joined by Stewart the GOAT Ehoff. I'm sure you guys have all been watching him, following him. He's doing some really dope shit on LinkedIn, and you have some speaking stuff going on too, don't you? What is it? Experimentation Elite, CXL or EXL?
Experimentation Elite in June, and then CXL, now EXL in October. So looking forward to coming out to Texas and seeing you and seeing some of the homies.
Eat some tacos. It's going to be great.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. So before we get started, I'm going to do the usual housekeeping. Y'all better subscribe, follow, do all this stuff. Otherwise, Stewart the GOAT will find you and he'll just say bad things about you behind your back. I don't know.
I won't. I definitely won't.
I don't think you have a mean bone in your body, to be fair.
That's very kind of you. It's probably the British thing, right?
It's so disarming versus us shitty Americans. So before we jump into the topic, actually, let me set the stage here. The reason why I wanted to talk to you is you and I have had some interesting catch-ups around scaling experimentation programs, talking about how hard it is in lower maturity programs to scale up. I don't know. It was like 2 or 3 months ago, and we had a conversation, and that really got me going around what is the hardest to scale experimentation programs. This is 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, whatever it is. What's the hardest to move up in the increments of testing quantity? Mm-hmm. I really wanted to explore this concept with you. But before we get started, you're extremely qualified to talk about this topic as a super senior person in experimentation at RS. Tell me a little bit, let's give you like 30 seconds to brag about your qualifications here.
I'll do my best. I'm not the best at bragging. Try to be as humble as possible, but thank you for buttering me up all the same. I head up the experimentation program at RS. I joined the company nearly 6 years ago, which is crazy to think about. And when I joined, I was a software engineer building tests in what was then considered the optimization team. And it was a very siloed team. Stuff was like chucked over the fence, right? We built some tests. The TLDR of that is, of the tests that we ran, it never impacted the product roadmap because experimentation was just not connected to what product we're doing. So I led the charge in the business on building out a center of excellence. You know, we stopped doing all those kinds of tests and we embedded experimentation into the product roadmaps, and we basically like hit refresh on the program. We went down to 0 tests and built it all the way from the ground up. And today we're running an average of 100 tests a year. We're continuing to increase on that. We've got 12 unique product squads within the business that are running tests. You know, we've got, all these different approaches and frameworks and tons of great stuff that's really going on in the program. So there you go. That's my 30 seconds of bragging that hopefully qualifies me enough to talk with you about this topic.
It does. I mean, it obviously does. 100 tests is probably the upper echelon of experimentation squads. So awesome. Really cool to see. So back to that original question that really got me intrigued. What do we think is the hardest? And I had it kind of, these are the bands that I had. 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 15, 15 to 30, or just 30 to N, whatever number that is. Very high number, whatever that may be. So I posed this question to a couple communities, Experimentation, TLC, and I got some pretty interesting replies. I think overall, the general sentiment was that 0 to 1 was the toughest. But let me call out some specific people who had some pretty good, interesting thoughts to think about this. So Will Fang started off by saying it depends. I think that's a pretty safe, easy thing. I think actually everything about this is just it depends. And we could just answer it, call a podcast, done, we did it. It depends, move on. But really, let's explore the nuance. So he goes on saying 0 to 1 is the hardest because it's really getting resources, implementation, solid data, resourcing for actually running the tests, not just building and setting up the tools, but actually running out the tests. Slobodan and Kelly Wortham both agreed with that. I tend to agree with what he says there, and I'll spoil it by saying my hot take is that it actually is going from 0 to 1. That is the absolute hardest of all of them. That's not to say it's not objectively hard to go from 15 to 30 or whatever it is, but what do you think? You think that's a tough thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a slightly different camp in that I think 0 to 1 isn't necessarily the hardest bit. I think that is hard, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to spoil too much on what I think too early on. But I think some of the later stages on how you operationalize and scale that up can be even harder than just running your first test.
So from there, Eddie Aguilar agreed also. And he said that especially on the implementation side, but also trust in your program, if you're going from 0 to 1, is just non-existent, right? Pretty thought-provoking. I'm like, yeah, because especially if you're trying to build it entirely from scratch without that culture of experimentation, that executive sponsorship, that buy-in. People don't know what it is. People don't know how to use it. So it's all those things, and people don't even know what you're doing or if it'll even work.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's some great comments and some great thoughts there about that 0 to 1 piece. People tend to think about the technology aspects, which is definitely a hurdle, right? If you don't have a tool or a platform, like how are you even going to run a test? What does that even look like? And also, more often than not, you spoke about culture there as well with leadership mandate. Most people in a kind of 0 to 1 scenario are either going to be in one of two camps. Either they've been brought in fresh to an organization that said, we really want to do this and we're going to give you the resources, we're going to give you the people, you're going to have budget to go buy a platform and go and do that. Or it's someone that exists within their organization that has seen the light and knows that experimentation is the thing to do and they want to do it, and they have none of that. And I guess there's two polarizing cases there where it sounds like many of the people who might have been submitting kind of the responses to your question there, they're probably in the latter camp where they haven't got the mandate. And I guess that's maybe what we want to tease into and talk a little bit more about, right?
Well, I had a third scenario of someone heard the buzzword CRO and then they hire what they think is a person who has all of the best practices and will just do things on your site to print money, which...
Yeah, or an agency, right? Not necessarily an internal hire, actually more often than not an agency. That's the snake oil stuff.
Yeah, a lot of it is snake oil on the agency side. But there are plenty of scenarios where you might be a single person program and you're like, I need help. I'm going to supplement the help through agency. That's what I did when I was at Gartner. I was using Spiro to help with engineering. We didn't have enough dev resources. So Mariana Bonanomi. Mariana, I am so sorry if I mispronounce your name. If you've listened to this podcast episodes before, I suck at names. So she was citing 15 to 30 as the hardest due to tooling constraints. I think her genesis of her point is like, you might outgrow the tool quickly, and going from 15 to 30, you'll ultimately need to invest in more mature tools, which means kind of almost tearing it down and restarting again.
Yeah, that speaks to me, man, because that's where we were at RS, right? Like, in fact, it's one of the talk tracks that I did experimentationally. God, when was that? 2022, probably. All about engineering, right? I introduced myself as a software engineer first, right, on the podcast. And that's where my career started. And that's very much the chasm that we had to cross at RS. So I think she's absolutely right. That is, for me, probably one of the hardest points in an experimentation program where, you might have embedded just some tooling and you've probably got some loose practices and you've maybe taken and by the way, this is not a criticism, the quick and dirty approach, right, is what people say. And I'm a big believer in that, right? Just get stuff done, push out results, right? And you've got to be brutal, you've got to be ruthless, you've got to prove it out, right? And to do that, you've got to maybe cut some corners on what might be the best scientific process or the best approach, right? You ain't got to worry about that. You've got bigger problems to think about in terms of just getting people to believe in it. Once you get there, it's then a case of like, you now need to think, you're not thinking about scale when you first start off, unless you're in that scenario one with the mandate. You're just thinking about that quick and dirty thing. And so I think she's right. You have to tear it down and you have to think, actually, if we're really up for this, what does it actually look like from a kind of a longer term strategy perspective?
So when Eddie says there's no trust in the program, right? You have to shortcut that trust as quickly as possible. If you spend 8 months building out the foundation of the program and they're like, I hired you to make me money and you're not making me money, what's going on? Well, you build the foundation. Yeah, that foundation might be scalable, but unfortunately, people are looking for, when they hire you, these quick wins. It might not be the case in every company, but in many companies, especially if you're that one-person team, you have to show value so quickly. And in order to do that, you're not following the best process. You have to balance so many things in the air. Yeah, the best case scenario might be you take a year to set up your data foundation, have full confidence in everything, do research, do this and that. The reality is they want to win in like 2 weeks. In many cases.
That's it. And I guess that 0 to 1 thing, having that relentless approach to just shipping something, running a test, getting a result, it doesn't really matter what that result is. It doesn't really matter if you follow best practices or processes. It doesn't even matter if the hypothesis is backed by research or any data. It could just be you took a look at the website and you saw, I don't know, the add to cart button was below the fold and you said, okay, let's just run it above the fold, see if it makes a difference, right? It may or may not. But the important thing, I think, for me on that 0 to 1 thing is, as hard as it is, right, is to just go through one full turn of the flywheel as quickly as possible, because you then bring a bunch of different people on board to say, here's what it looks like just going through that process once, right? And then you can think about, okay, now how do we do it a second time, third time, fifth time? And then once you get to that 15 to 30 bracket, you're probably thinking about how do we now make this scalable? How do we make it repeatable? But if you're on the provision of you've been brought in, you got to make some money, you got to get that first test out of the door, right?
And to be clear, the purpose of what you're describing is to validate that the process works before mashing the gas pedal.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where it's okay if your first test is a button color test or shit. I usually run AA tests in my first test just to validate that things work. Machines are connected. You're seeing data. It makes sense. There's no SRM, stuff like that. Then run a button color test. Fuck it. Just try it out. See what happens, because the purpose is not to win. The purpose is to optimize the system of winning, so to speak, or learning, whatever you want to call. So a couple other call outs and quotes. So Ton had an interesting perspective that kind of mimics this. He said that 15 to 30 was the hardest. He was citing Optimizely's report on the experimentation gap. One thing he said related to this is when you're at that 15 to 30, you have to unlearn all the bad habits that you learned to get to 15. And I don't disagree with that. It's good call out, right? To get to 15, you're doing these things to get you to a velocity, testing it out. You're just getting started in the program. You might have had a bunch of low-hanging fruit to just quickly try out, testing some bug fixes, whatever it is, which I disagree with. Bull is a whole other story. But anyway, you're doing these things to just like get the flywheel spinning. And in doing so, you might actually be following the wrong processes, and you really have to unlearn them and get back to the proper process quickly.
Yeah, I think so. There's like a driving analogy you can use here where you can get to 15 by short-circuiting, cutting corners, doing it that quick and dirty way, right? Same as with if you're driving, you can get your dad or your mum to sit in the car with you in the passenger seat and just kind of show you how to drive. But that doesn't mean you're going to pass the test necessarily, right? And it doesn't build good long-term driving habits in the same way as, if you come into a program where you have that mandate and you're kind of thinking about that longer-term thing, you would probably set it up and do it differently, right? So I actually think that, it's a really good point from Ton. You have to unlearn some stuff, right? That's kind of why the driving thing came into my head, because you get so many people with bad habits when their cousin taught them to drive or something like that. They never check their mirrors, never do this, that, and the other. You could be building an experimentation program for scale, but you've got all these blind spots, you've got these bad habits in your program that you've established just to get to that point.
Yeah, and just to be clear, just because you've run a bunch of tests doesn't mean they're quality. In the same way that just because you have a license doesn't mean you should be on the road. There are many licensed drivers who should not be driving. I know there's a lot of dog shit drivers in Austin who should not have licenses, and I don't know what they're doing. Dude, one day, it was a couple days ago, I was driving. I shit you not. I looked over to my right because I was trying to merge into that lane, and there was some dude who was passed out in his car driving because he had autopilot Tesla on. And I was like, what is happening here? And the car couldn't detect me trying to go into the lane because this motherfucker was fast asleep.
Those people shouldn't have a license. They probably shouldn't run testing programs either, right?
Could you imagine if they're doing it? They might be doing both.
There's probably someone out there who's a really bad driver and they're running a testing program. Let's not call them out, though.
Yeah. So related to that, Jen Kunz had a very interesting call out. Velocity does not equal quality. So you could get from 0 to 1 in 2 seconds if you just run a button color test. Yep. You can go from 1 to 5 really quickly if you run multiple button color tests. You can go from 5 to 10 if you do all the button shape tests. It is very much not simply velocity. And I think that's that's back to Will's point originally, that it depends. It's not just velocity that you should be focused on, but for the purposes of this conversation, I was trying to keep it as simple as possible because there's so much dependencies. But it is important to consider that velocity is not the only thing. Tan actually called it out. He's like, it's about decisions made. That's probably the most important thing.
For sure. And this is where velocity as a metric can be really butchered and really like bastardized in many ways, right? Where, you do have companies that are out there who have hundreds of product teams and they're running hundreds of tests, but those tests are only a small proportion of things that those product teams actually ever do, right? So you could have the illusion of, hey, there's a really high velocity program kind of going on here with hundreds of tests, but that velocity is really only just a byproduct of how much execution power that business has. Would you then say they've got a good experimentation culture when they only test 1 in every 10 things that they ship? No, probably not, right? So I think some of these call outs around, how we look at velocity, how we evaluate velocity, what that looks like, are really spot on. There is that quality lens. Personally, I like to think about it in terms of, if you have a product squad, how many things do they ship per week, per month, per year that are tested versus not tested, right? And for me, that's more thinking about velocity as a ratio rather than just a flat number, right?
I was going to say, what percent of decisions were validated? That's just quantity, it's percent.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure. And it also kind of gets away from some of this dick measuring contest stuff that you get with velocity just being as a flat number, right? You get people like, I'm running thousands of tests a year. And you actually get people who aspirationally are like, yeah, I really want to run thousands of tests a year. And it's like, your company probably isn't even capable of shipping 1,000 changes a year, let alone doing 1,000 tests, right? So some of these call outs around the different aspects of velocity and what it actually means and some of the context that sits around it is really important, right?
Sometimes it's probably a cherry pick too. Like, all right, how many tests have won? Oh, it's won 1% of the time. Oh, well, what's another big number? Ship tests. We shipped a bunch of tests. Oh, okay. Well, then, great. That's the number that we're just going to use to brag about our program, which I guess if the purpose is let's brag about our program to leadership to get more buy-in, I get it.
Do leadership care about velocity, though?
They do. Perhaps... Are you asking?
No, I'm challenging, right? I'm not so sure that they do, right?
They might, some might. Well, so like sometimes it's just big numbers get people excited. Like if I set a 0.5% conversion rate lift, most people be like, meh. And I said, that's $6 billion because it's Microsoft.
Oh, yeah.
They'd be like, oh, that's a lot better. I like that number better. So sometimes it's just the frame. Same thing with the percent ship. The percent ship might not be sexy, percent ship that's validated might not be as sexy as tests shipped.
Yeah.
Or tests validated. Because it might just be you're always at 70%. And maybe you go to 71% or 67%.
It's an interesting metric though, because you're still kind of saying, well, and what I'm about to say is probably far out of the realms of an organizational maturity that many people may exist in. But if you're I would like to think, or at least if I was the CEO, right, I'd be looking at that and saying, or at least the CEOs of companies that are doing experimentation at scale to the point where they don't even have an experimentation team or whatever, they would look at that and say, right, so we're shipping 30% or spending 30% of our engineering and product resource and our design resource and all the other bits that surround it, shipping things that we have no or little confidence in, or at least that we've not validated, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the way that I'd be seeing it, which again, how you describe the numbers kind of drives the behavior, right?
All right, so the last cut from the community I'll offer here is Merritt was suggesting company size. And he actually had something that felt counterintuitive, but as I explored, I'm like, actually, this makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. So he was saying for bigger companies, it's harder to get from 0 to 1 versus smaller companies, it's harder to get from 5 to 15. And I was like, does that make sense? Because on one hand, you think like, well, theoretically, big company equals more resources equals much easier to get things set up. But on the flip side, bigger company equals a lot of politics, equals a lot of approvals, equals a lot of, you have like getting a culture of experimentation in a bigger company is probably going to be a lot harder because there's so many people that have to get bought in. Only if you have that top down, like literal CEO top down, even then a VP could totally mess that up. But when you're a small company and you have like 20 people, right? And you run the website, everything website runs through you and you're the experimentation person. Fuck it. You could just be like, we're just going to test this. I'm just going to do this. So, but then when you're that smaller company, getting money for resources is the harder part. So that's where I'm like, that was counterintuitive. But as I thought about it, I'm like, actually, that makes a lot of sense.
There's a bunch of different variables that are kind of flying around in my head here, because I think you could, it's a really good point from Merritt. And I think you could also argue the opposite in that you could kind of say, well, it should be really hard for you could say it's hard or easy for the enterprise, or hard or easy for the startup, right? And I think there's arguments sort of for and against within that. My experience of building experimentation programs within enterprise, the company I work for is 10,000 plus employees, right? And we're distributed all around the world, is that I guess that, that 0 to 1 bit, and then the further scale up, there is the bureaucracy, there is the politics. It can be difficult. And let's not forget, there's also InfoSec policies and data sharing policies and analytics. We're now in a post-GDPR world, maybe not so much in America, but at least in Europe, GDPR is so egregious, it's so heavy. You just got the EU constantly watching over your shoulder, like, what data are you sharing, right? And these big companies that, they're primed to get fined, right? So they have to do everything the right way. So that can hold you back. But at the same time, resources is not always a problem. Sometimes big companies, you got people who've got space to do stuff, right? Whereas a small company, you could say the opposite. They're a startup, they've got limited resources, but then also you're a startup, so you don't have all the bureaucracy, right? So there's so many like for and against and pros and cons. It actually makes it really difficult in these different situations to kind of say what is hard. I guess we're not trying to say what's hardest here, right? I think we're just trying to talk about the options and try to give some credence to all the different experimenters out there that are sitting in all these different kind of circumstances, right? Because that is part of the problem, in that you see stuff on LinkedIn like, just go build a culture of experimentation, and it's so irrelevant to all the different nuances of all people's different scenarios, where they sit, what their organizations look like. This is a complex topic, right?
All right, I'm gonna ask you one follow-up to that. How many companies have a true, what you would define as culture of experimentation?
A handful, right?
Yeah.
A handful, right? Those are the ones that people reference all the time, right? For me, the sign of a true culture of experimentation is that my job doesn't exist within that company, right? Because why do you need me?
You don't need an experimentation evangelist, because everyone's an experimentation evangelist.
Right, exactly, right? And maybe there are still people in those companies. I don't know, right? I'm not close enough to it. Maybe we can talk to Lucas or something like that. I can tell us what booking was like. And I know that his role in booking was still the evangelist role, but I think you get to that point, it's more about platforms and operations and systems and keeping all those teams kind of swimming in the right direction. You also get more into like the statistics and kind of the marginal gains on the decision making for 10,000 plus experiments a year is huge, right? So how many companies really have a true culture of experimentation? Very few, right? Or very few can actually claim that they do, right?
So that's where my brain went to with all of this conversation. Is I'm listening to these answers. I'm biased, because I haven't worked at a Microsoft.com experimentation program. I haven't worked at a Booking.com. My experience has been the solo CRO or a small team of CROs on trying to figure it out, do their best, or agency side. So my experience is biased. I come to the table with my bias. I know that's where I'm at. But for me, that's where I say, how many true cultures of experimentation are there? Very few. And that it's just because, to me, the achieving a culture of experimentation is so high that it should not just be a name that's thrown out. You have to do a certain amount of things to achieve it. And on the flip side, my brain's like, how many people are even running one test? Not many. And I'd say, in fact, the vast majority are not running many. When I say the vast majority, I mean companies that have the potential traffic and resourcing to test. Do they even have a testing tool installed? Dennis at Convert ran this study. I will not cite numbers. I don't remember. But it was a lot of people who had Optimize installed and didn't use it at all, or used it for as a CMS to just make changes to their site without actually testing. So there's a lot of people who, even with the capabilities to test and all the barrier removed, still don't test. So my case that I'm going to make is going from 0 to 1 is the hardest. And that's the stake that I claim.
Okay. I think I'm in Ton's camp in particular around, going from 15 to 30 or scaling beyond that. I think that's the hardest. That's where I sit.
So just for listeners, there won't be a shit you need to know this week, because the next part of this will now just be Shiva proving Stewart wrong about his take. So we'll just move on from here. Let me make my stake in here. The variables that we were kind of discussing, what makes it hard to scale an experimentation program, what's required. These variables are the ones that are so much harder to achieve in the 0 to 1 compared to the 15 to 30. If you got to 15, you've already probably, if you haven't and you've run to 15 tests, I'd question the validity of your program. But let's say, assuming you've got it to that 15, you've addressed a lot of these issues. That's why even getting to 15 is so hard. Getting to 1 is hard. here's some variables. For me, what we talked about, culture, right? Top down, there has to be some mechanism in place that you will accept data through an experiment, through anything. And many times that doesn't exist, especially in the smaller companies where it's like you're the director of marketing and you report into the chief person and it's a smaller company. So much of that is politics. So much of that's like, it's my baby. We're still early. I've made the decisions up until now as the CEO. So why the fuck would I delegate to you? It's still my thing. As you get to bigger companies, you literally have to delegate. Otherwise, nothing gets done. So for me, part one's culture. Couple other things include like data infrastructure. Do you even have good data to test? This is kind of what Eddie and the other folks talked about. Do you have the money to buy a tool? Do you have people to run the tests? Do you have good data? Do you have resourcing to build tests? Do you have the expertise to run the program? All of these things are theoretically set in place when you get to the 15 mark, which is why I say getting those things in place at first, all working, is extremely hard. And that's what gets you from 0 to 1, which is hard.
None of those variables that you just shared matter at all getting to 0 to 1. So let's break them down, right? So culture, if you're just trying to get quick and dirty from 0 to 1 tests, the culture is irrelevant, right? All you need to find is a small sliver, like a very thin crack in the organization and its current structure and ways of working or whatever, and embed yourself in that, right? To get to that one test. The culture thing, yeah, that matters down funnel, but to do the one test, culture, not convinced. The tooling. This is probably the biggest hurdle, right? Because you're not going to go out and buy a tool just to do one test if you've then not got the backup, and you end up in this chicken and egg situation of can't run a test if you don't have a tool, but you can't have a tool if you're not going to run any tests, right?
So to build on my case for that, yes, buy-in for the tool, like the purchase of the tool, the actual money, $500 a month, $100,000, whatever the dollar amount, it is something that has to go through approvals. But it's not just that, it's implementation, right? The tool has to, if it's server side, I don't know if you're going from 0 to 1, if you're going to immediately jump into server side, especially if you don't have the culture and all that stuff. But even client side, it has to sit on top of something. You have to get engineering to buy into it. You have to get approvals from other folks to get that tool working, and hopefully guardrails in place that other people can't just go in and fuck up the site. So that's where I'd say I agree. That one's probably the hardest one to get from 0 to 1.
I have a very creative solution for the technology problem though, and the vendors aren't going to like it. But I think the vendors have some work to do here in helping to sell this stuff in, right? I don't know of a single experimentation vendor, and I've spoken to lots of them, right, who wouldn't be open to doing a free of charge, no obligation, proof of concept, and work with whatever that company is to get the tool in, client-side tool, get the tag in, and just run a test and see what you learn. And also, just leaning into the enterprise experience there, that's the way that you get stuff done, right? You lean on companies to prove their worth and bring in the expertise externally to get you some of that validation, right? To say, well, actually, we spent no money and we've proven that this model could work. We've done one turn of the flywheel. What could it look like if we did 10? What could it look like if we did 20, right? And at that point, you can have a conversation around buying a tool, right?
But when we think about testing, 1 in every 10 tests from all the data that we see wins, right? It's almost you're playing Russian roulette to try and get the test winner on that demo. It will cost the testing tool a lot of money to set up that beta. That might not get the return on that first test. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the 1 in 10 because I think that's skewed. It's not representative. It's just a stat that it's easy to understand and compelling. But let's take that at its face value. 1 in 10% chance that you'll be able to prove that value, and the vendor is going to spend a lot of money to get the tool set up. That's assuming you set it up properly, then fuck your site up, right? If you don't have testing principles in place, the other piece, like, the expertise, you could be running a test and then engineering rolls out a site update and that fucks up your test. And then the one chance you had to get it working, that CEO sees that the site broke from testing and they're like, never again will we test.
I can see as we kind of walk through the scenarios why it's hard, and I don't disagree that it's not still hard. I'll challenge you on 2 things there. The first one is around the outcome of the test. Again, I don't think it matters. I don't think if the test wins or loses, and I never use the term loses for a test, because for me, if you're shipping a test, you're learning, right? You're winning.
If you ship the test, you won.
If you ship the test, you won, right? It's
yeah.
That's all it is. So it's great if that test tells you, hey, don't do that thing, because then you could go back to the organization and say, hey, how many other things are we just shipping that might also have this kind of same outcome, right? Where it's just completely flat.
Wait, can I challenge you on that? You said it doesn't matter. You just shipped it.
Yeah.
But we go back to the beginning of one of the hardest things from going from 0 to 1 is trust in the program.
Yeah.
Trust that this thing's going to work. Shipping a test is meaningless if the cost is $0, but what value are you proving? So
Yeah.
I guess if you run a high quality test where you've learned something, fine. But then we go back to that conversation we had where many times when you're just getting the program set up, you're not testing high quality stuff.
Well, even if you just change the color of the button, or if you just move the position of something on the UI, or even if you remove something, actually, I think the removal tests are kind of the more interesting ones, right? Because, you're going to make a big difference. There might be some feature that the company wants to spend 6 months of engineering time investing into it. And you just go, do you know what? Let's take it off the page and let's see what happens, right? I think there are a bunch of different creative low effort tests you could feasibly run that get you to some value. I think what's important to define within the success objectives that you set with your organization when you're doing that first test is, what do we actually consider a win? This flies in the face of what you're saying, where you get companies that just want to do CRO and they just want to drive conversion, right? And so if you don't drive a conversion lift on that first test, then you're failing. You fail to do your job correctly. I would just always challenge in those situations, all these companies, they have so much resource and so much money that they're plowing into building features or shipping things or cutting through technical debt or whatever it is they're trying to do. They're trying to make more money from their digital experiences, right? A losing test in the true sense of a negative conversion shift or a negative subscription shift or whatever it is the metric you care about is a sure enough sign that there will no doubt be other things in your business that equally are damaging or doing nothing. And if there's an executive in the room that doesn't want to deal with that reality, I'd be very concerned about the longevity of any kind of future in an experimentation program in that situation, right?
So then that goes back to culture actually is important.
Not for the immediate first test. I guess, if the success metric is we shipped the first test, I think it's then what happens after that, right? How do you use that test as the Trojan horse to sell it into the organization that gets you to do more tests?
So in your talking, you said, I'm going to sound like a debate, bro. I kind of hate this, but whatever.
Pick me apart, man. Pick me apart. I love it.
We'll be on Twitch streaming, trying to debate other people. So we'll call ourselves the CRO bros. You were talking about like the culture doesn't matter as much, right? I think it does, because to be clear, if you are at an organization and you're trying to run tests and they're like, I don't want to spend $500 a month for a testing tool. Mm-hmm. I don't want to let you run any tests. Our data sucks. We don't want to fix it. Then like the culture sucks and you will never get to a high quality of experimentation ever. But that's still, to me, that still supports my point of 0 to 1 being hard, because in many cases, you have to have a baseline amount of buy-in to that. And there are many leaders, I'm not saying it's all, but there are many leaders that will never let you get from 0 to 1 as just a cultural thing that they don't care about experimentation and they won't let you do it.
I think that's the difference between what I would define as local culture and like global culture within your organization, right? The trick here is if you were to even run a test and kind of go through that process, would an exec in your company even know about it? I mean, I guess it depends how big your company is, right? But I can tell you flat out right now, if you joined a 10,000 plus person organization, you ran a test on a small sliver of your website in a single market, hardly anyone would know about it, right?
And to add to that, Tan kind of called this out, testing tool of $100,000 is like a rounding error to them.
Exactly, right? So you're kind of working on different orders of magnitude at that point, right? But still, actually, funnily enough, the enterprise companies have way more to swing when it comes to these vendors, right? Because if you've got a big name, like you're a FTSE 100 company or S&P 500 or whatever, right? And you want to work with a vendor, hell yeah, they're going to bend over backwards to kind of help you to be successful and sell the tool in, right? So I think, and this is just from my lived experience, I think enterprise has such a huge advantage on this, right?
The rich get richer.
The rich get richer, stupid. Man. The rich get richer. But to go back to your point on kind of the culture thing, this is the difference between the local and the global culture. The global culture is eventually going to hold you back from scaling on your experimentation program. Mm-hmm. But the problem that you're talking about is like a tiger problem. And actually running 0 to 1 test is a mouse problem, right? I think that's the distinction that I would make. And will the exec even know you run the test? Probably not. Just crack on, right?
So as we go back to this, it depends. There's a difference between 0 to 1 with the intention of moving up and continuing to grow, i.e. build a foundation. And then there's 0 to 1 is in just launch a test. And I think that's where we're talking about is 0 to 1 with an eye towards moving up.
For sure.
And ultimately scaling. If you are a part of a culture where you could, like you said, you could just throw a testing tool, Google optimize because it was free and run the test, but you're never going to go beyond that. Your ceiling is 1, then, or your ceiling is 5, right? And you're not going to do anything more than that because you said it's the tiger problem, whatever. I guess it is harder to get from 5 to 15. So for me, I'm trying to grow my program up to get to like 30 tests a month. I'm not close to that. It's a work in progress. There's a lot of stuff that still has to be done. But from getting from 0 to 1 required a boss who hired me and his boss who approved getting CRO. Both of them very much value experimentation, right? So basically top-down approval of it. We're still not testing everything. Our testing tool took a long time to set up. Our data infrastructure was not great. It's in a very good spot now, but it was not great, and that took a long time for us to get to that. I was a single-person CRO team without that executive sponsorship and culture that I wanted to grow it to 15, but after 3 months, they're like, why haven't we run any tests? It's like, well, because our data is not trustworthy to put a test on top of that. So that's where I say it's hard to get from 0 to 1, where let's focus on the data piece, right? If you're at 15 tests and your data sucks and it's not trustworthy, how are you running 15 tests?
Yeah.
You're doing the wrong things if you're at 15 tests and you don't trust your data.
Yeah.
There's like the assumption built in to get from 0 to 1 that you trust your data to get to that 1.
Yeah.
And also if you're at 15, you trust it.
Yeah, again, if the one's your AA test, as you mentioned earlier, I guess that exposes the data problems, right? And kind of says, well, if we want to really go at this, we're going to have to do some kind of under the hood work to kind of get it moving. But again, some of those things that you spoke about, it doesn't stop you from shipping the first test, right?
Yeah.
No matter how bad that test is, no matter how non-data driven the hypothesis is, or just, quick and dirty the technology implementation is. But again, we're talking about the scale, right? For me, it's kind of as individual practitioners, and if there are any kind of solo CRO folks sat in the basement of their organization who have done their first test, or they've done multiple tests, but they're still struggling with the traction. For me, it's what do you do with those test outcomes, and how do you sell the process, the learning, the knowledge that you got through doing those tests, and the relationships that you will have inevitably built in kind of socializing that, through whoever contributed to running that test through your business. Because from my lived experience, and this has taken, I've been at my company for nearly 6 years, and I think it's only in the last 2 to 3 years we've really seen significant process. So it's a slog, right? It takes time. Just what are you doing now to sell experimentation into your organization? What are you doing to bring people on the journey, to evangelize? And that's not going to be everyone all at once. All you need to find is kind of your initial allies that help you to kind of bed stuff down. And then for us, as I said, we tore our whole program down and we started again. It's like a New Game Plus thing, right?
So for us non-nerds, what is New Game Plus?
So if you've completed a game, like lots of games, they put, started a new game in, it's the same story, it's the same process that you go through, but you get to keep all the stuff that you achieved in your previous save file into that new game. So if you just got like a badass sword or something like that does 1 billion damage, you can just bring that into your new game, and you can just kind of plow through. And that's kind of what you can do with your experimentation program. If you get to that 15 point with a Google Optimize, may it rest in peace, or some other tool that's kind of, quick and dirty, and it's not built for scale, but it's built to kind of get you to that first kind of playthrough, sticking to the video game analogy. Maybe I shouldn't too much, it might be embarrassing. If it sees you through to that reset, I think that's absolutely fine, right? For me, it's the New Game Plus, where you kind of take that to the next level. You start to think about these bigger things like culture of experimentation and server side, and how do we scale out a process, and how do we monitor kind of all these different experiments we're doing. Those are the tiger problems that you are probably, if you're only running a handful of tests in your organization, probably not even ready to start tackling those problems, right?
So I'll say this, I'm less convinced that I'm right, that going from 0 to 1 is the hardest of all of them. Yes. They all have their own, and that's that was an uphill battle to climb. I'm less right.
Well done.
Yeah, Stewart is now convinced me I'm less right than I was before. I do generally think it has much more challenges that are harder to accomplish, especially when consider most of the time it's the solo person trying to figure it out on their own, versus 5 to 15, you kind of have a team, you have your ideally, hopefully you have your allies, you have your team, you have some leadership. Where I say 0 to 1 is the hardest compared to like 5 to 15, where it suffers the most challenges is you don't have the foundation. It's a lot harder to build a foundation than scale the foundation. And that's where I generally feel is the case. But 5 to 15 has a ton of challenges. All right, I do want to wrap with some hopefully tactical, tangible advice we could give. I know we started nudging on it of what are ways to remove the roadblocks. I'd say if you're at the maybe 15 test to 30 test mark or above, a lot of these thoughts or advice are probably going to be more nuanced and it's going to maybe not be as applicable. But I do want to try and help people in the 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 15 range, remove those blockers, identify ways to scale the program because it can be challenging, especially if you have toxic leadership, your data sucks. Certain things are just going to be hard as fuck to solve for, right? Like if your CEO is just doesn't care about data, showing them a winning test isn't going to magically change their mind. They're still going to be like, that's cool. Another thing I'm going to ignore. Like,
right. Yeah.
What are some learnings you had in scaling out the program that you had that you could say tactically, these are some considerations to make sure that you watch out for or solve for, or tactical things you should do to scale your program?
You mentioned resiliency, and that is something that I definitely want to reinforce. You got to be in this for the long haul. It's going to take some time to get traction. You're going to have frustrating days, but you're also going to have some really good days where you get that stuff over the line and you get the wins and it feels amazing, right?
Yeah.
It really feels like you're kind of doing stuff. Equally, you're going to look back on stuff you did a year ago and you're going to cringe. You're going to be like, oh my God, is that really what we were doing? Like, and we're doing this now? The resilience is key, and don't measure the progress in like days or weeks. You got to measure it in like months or even years, right? Hopefully, as you step through that journey as an individual, as a team, that reflects in your growth within the company as well in terms of what you've delivered in your maturity. Another thing I guess I'd mention is there's no such thing as over communicating and overselling kind of what you're doing, right? I'm not going to say be annoying, but be just like pre-annoying, right? Really get into people's inboxes, get onto team meetings, get onto all hands, get into kind of any kind of situation where you can talk about the importance of kind of running tests. If you can get results in front of people, like that's really powerful as well, especially if you can break it down into a way that people understand, right? One of the most powerful things that we've done internally at RS, and I've seen many other companies deploy this tactic as well, is to just play the guess the test game with people and just see how many people get it right, how many people get it wrong. The moral of the story is always you're going to get it wrong, right? And that's why we need to test.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be advice point number 2. I think the third is find your allies, right? Find your allies, but find your problems as well. There'll be some people in the business who will want to work with you and who will agree with you. And there'll be some people who are like not interested, you know, particularly when you think about product. There'll be areas of product in your organization that just don't really want to engage with it. They've just got a big laundry list of features they're going to build, and they're totally fine with that. That's not where you want to spend your calories. You want to spend your calories with people who are interested in engaging with you, who are going to give you that active participation in that collaboration, and who are going to then give you some stories that you can go back to some of the more challenging parts of your business and use that as collateral or as a Trojan horse that kind of gets you into that space, right?
One of the things that I totally resonates with what you just said is I think you kind of nudging towards it, but I'll pull it out and say, just be helpful. Like, be helpful to these people, create the allies, and then be helpful to them. Because it might be that, for example, with me, I'm the CRO person, but I had to set up our analytics. So people come to me and they're like, I need help with this data thing. Can you help me? Like, it's not my job, but I'll help. Anyway. That's fine. I'll do it. Because you're creating the allies. And once you get these allies and you start to understand their problems, like let's say you're working with your paid search team and they're like, dude, our lead quality is dog shit. Well, yeah, maybe the top-down leadership saying we really need to get volume. But if you're like, all right, well, let me do both of these things. Let me figure out why quality might not be great. And let's also uptick the quantity. Sure. Let's figure out why the quality is not there. And are there specific segments? Create these, understand their problems and realize that experimentation is a tool to help solve their problems.
100%.
And then be helpful to them, and that creates the allies. That's one of the toughest things. I've seen a lot of I was very much anti-hippo. Man, hippos suck. I hate them. They're stupid. They have stupid opinions, and they're just stupid all the time with their stupid things. I've very much changed my tune on this, that win the hippo over, become their ally. That's because it's better to be friends with the hippo than enemies. And when they're on your side and you've shown to help them in whatever ways, first of all, helping the hippo helps the business. It just does. But in helping the business, they'll be your ally. And if they trust you, maybe they don't trust you at first, but the more they trust you, what is it? It's like, what is it? Those, isn't it like fish that eat barnacles off like the whale?
Yeah.
Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Like,
they're not going to eat each other, but they're supporting
exactly.
each other in
The
the
whale's
ecosystem,
like,
right?
I'll leave the fish alone because the fish is helping me. And I'll just like, it's great. It's just symbiotic. Create the symbiotic relationship.
That's
As a person who almost failed out of med school, I'm surprised I remembered this thing.
That's right. Yeah, this comes down to, we didn't really touch on it much, but it comes down to output versus outcome mentality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you can change within the business what looks like an output and kind of walk it back to an outcome and change that through running a test or influence kind of the decisioning on that, then that's how you'll kind of win friends and win influence, right?
Okay, I love this. Next episode we do with Stewart, the Go Ehoff, will be how to change the mindset from output to outcome. I love that.
That's a huge topic. Definitely needs
I
its
love
own
that.
episode.
I love that. Cool. All right, Stewart, where can the folks find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I guess that's the main space, right? So there aren't many Ehoffs in the world. So if you just type in Ehoff, I'm gonna.
Is it a hard H? I thought it was like Ehoff.
You can honestly, it gets butchered so much as a kind of really obscure name. You can just say it however you want, and it just glosses straight over my head.
So I suck with names, but to be fair, my name's also hard to pronounce, and people mispronounce it. So I have built-in like.
You just
get into
it, right?
Cool. So they can find you on LinkedIn. You're also going to be speaking at Experimentation Elite and EXL in Austin.
That's right.
2 awesome events to hear Stewart the Goat speaking some truth bombs and some cool stuff. Cool. Stewart the Goat Ehoff, absolute certified homie. Thank you so much for jumping in and talking a whole, basically, hour on this topic. Very much appreciated for you taking the time out of this.
Thanks, man. It's been amazing. Hopefully people find it useful. Hopefully there's some stuff you can take away from this. And thanks for having me on.
Take care, everyone.